Yeah, I think we just finished this one, and we're about to move on to the next. Right? Does that look about right?
Yeah.
Political rather than military nation, important information operations, which is
Propaganda.
Propaganda.
Washington and his chief victories.
Right. Okay. So, there are really two wars happening during the American Revolution. There is a conventional war and there's an unconventional war. So both are going on at the same time. The conventional war is being fought by the Continental Army. So that's the force Washington himself is leading. This is an army organized, trained, etc., to look and feel like a European army. Okay? That's the intention. It's based on a European model, guys standing in nice rows, uniforms when you can get them, which is kind of hit or miss throughout the war. Sometimes they have uniforms, sometimes they don't have uniforms. Okay? The officers in this army are based on the European model. They're gentlemen. So to be an officer during the American Revolution, you're going to have come from a fairly wealthy background. Remember, we have no nobility to speak of here, so they're not getting noblemen, but they are getting the upper crust of American society. Okay? The discipline in the Continental Army is harsh. Guys are being flogged. Okay? Flogging is like whipping. Okay? Guys are having that done to them. And occasionally they're being shot for desertion. Shot or hung, depending on what the circumstance was. So again, very European in its outlook. This is all very much a European kind of mix. So what's the goal of the Continental Army as opposed to the kind of insurrection force, all right? If the Continental Army can show itself well enough, it prevents the British from distributing their army throughout the colonies, which would destroy the militia. Okay? The militia cannot stand up to a conventional force. We talked about that. So as long as Washington just can keep these guys occupied, so that they can't just start breaking the army up and send a battalion here and a battalion here and a company here and a company here, it means the militia has a chance to survive. If Washington doesn't do that, if there is no conventional army, the whole war is over in a matter of a month or two. Because the British just start breaking up their big force into smaller forces, they go out, they start mopping up all the militia everywhere, and the whole thing's over. So that's, I would argue, one of the most important things, is he's just got to exist so that the militia can survive.
Is it more of a distraction almost?
I'm sorry, more of a...
Distraction to keep the British occupied?
Yes, yeah, it is a distraction to a certain degree, because again, Washington's force doesn't win the majority of its battles. They lose the majority of their battles. But they fight just enough and win just enough, okay? They are the institutional revolution. When you're talking about this revolution, there's a kind of a theoretical thing. These are guys writing pamphlets, that kind of stuff. Okay, so there's a theoretical part of the revolution. There's a political part of the revolution, which is the Continental Congress, which is more often in Philadelphia, but they have to actually run away from Philadelphia for a little while at one point. Okay, so that's kind of the political aspect. But the army becomes the thing that everybody looks at as they're really doing this. You know, we're really doing this, we're really making it happen. And that's the army, that's kind of the symbol of the revolution. When people think about the revolution during the war, they don't think of Congress, because Congress is as worthless then as it is now. Okay, that hasn't changed, all right? But the army is the thing that is actually doing the fighting. It's actually engaging the enemy. It's actually working from the point of view of the colonists. Okay, so it's the institutional revolution. And again, you just have to win some battles, okay, enough battles to keep the Patriots' morale up so that they don't start to switch sides, and to get international respect. And that's going to be one of the key things that wins us this revolution. which again, it doesn't often get talked about. I'm sorry.
Yeah, General Lafayette. What?
Right. It's the European influence, especially the French influence. Without them, we don't win this war.
Did they really support the colonies, or did they just not like the British?
It's all about hating the British. Yeah, it's all about hating the British. They, in fact, supporting the colonies is actually a horrible move because it sends the message to other groups that it's okay to do this. And arguably, you know, when you follow the string, the French Revolution comes out of it. Not directly. It's not a straight line. It's kind of wavy. Okay? But the American Revolution will lead in some ways to the French Revolution. And again, it's not a nice straight line. There's other factors that are going to come into play. But it was a horrible move for the French. Great for us. Horrible move for the French. It was a totally stupid idea. But again, worked for us. So just win enough to keep the patriots from changing sides, and they get the international community involved to get them interested. And lastly, the army becomes a symbol of nationalism. And arguably in American history, during big wars, that's how the army is seen, the armed forces. Okay? They are the symbol of the nation. But we also have this tendency to, the minute the war is over, we don't want to have anything to do with the armed forces. Okay? So it's a very love-hate relationship the American people have. And actually that comes from the British. The British had always had kind of animosity toward their own army, at least. Navy not so much, but the army. Okay? So, that's the convention. Now, there's going to be a few campaigns very early on that are going to make it look like this whole thing is over within a year. And that's the New York and New Jersey campaigns of 1776. So quickly, we've got 3 battles in a row: Long Island, Harlem Heights, and Fort Washington, where the Americans are defeated very quickly. A matter of what, August, September, October, November, 3 months. So within 3 months, boom, 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 we're defeated 3 times, and New York and New Jersey, after that point, is in the British pocket for the rest of the war. AMC did a pretty good series a couple years ago about spies behind the lines in New York during the American Revolution, and I'm forgetting what the heck it was called.
Was it called Turn?
Turn or Turncoat or
There's one called Turn.
okay.
10
Yeah.
Washington Spies.
Yeah.
Washington Spies. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, and they did a good job of showing that New York City is occupied the whole war. It's not until 1783 that the British finally pull all their troops out. Okay. Now, part of the reason that works is in that case, not in every case, but in that case, the British are not harsh with the local population. By and large, the British are actually quite generous in the way they treat the locals. Okay?
I mean, technically they're British too.
What's that?
Technically, the locals are also British, you know?
Well, I mean, technically, so is everybody. I mean, from that point of view at this point, technically everybody's British, but they are, the British, because of that whole aristocratic background and all that, can be real jerks toward local populaces. And it's all about the commander. So when you have an intelligent local commander, as they did in this case, he realizes, don't antagonize the locals. Okay? Show them that we're all one big happy empire. There's nothing to be upset about. Okay? And so as a result, a lot of loyalists start coming forward. People who are Americans, but who are loyal to the British Empire, really start coming forward. And in fact, the British will form at least 2, maybe 3, I can't remember off the top of my head, 2 or 3 regiments of Americans who fight for the British during the war. Okay? Loyalist regiments. And again, that makes sense. We'd all been one happy empire for the longest time. And especially if you're ethnically British, from the British Isles, you know, Welsh, English, Scottish, okay, you're going to have, it's going to make sense you default to that. Now, if you're the communities that are Dutch or German or Swedish or Irish, less loyalty. And those communities are less likely to support the empire. Whereas if you're Welsh, Scottish, and English, you're more likely to support the empire. So, at this point, it looks quite frankly like this is not going to end well. And in fact, this is what Washington says to his brother right after that campaign. Read this one first and then read that. This is what Washington says to his brother in a letter. Yeah, we're going to lose this. At the same time, you've got Thomas Paine, who writes The Crisis. Very famous words you've probably heard. The Summer Soldier and Sunshine Patriot. Because there's a recognition at this point, boy, if you're still in the Army, you're really hardcore. Because if you're a betting man in the fall and winter of 1776, you're putting your money on, British are going to win that one. Okay? There's no reason you'd bet on the Americans. So if you stayed in the Army, you didn't desert at that time, you were really hardcore in your beliefs. You really believed in this cause. Or maybe you just couldn't escape, who knows. So, this is what Washington says publicly. Privately, he's telling his brother, I think we're done. Publicly, this is what he's saying. Now, why is Washington this hardcore?
Yeah.
Why? You're right. Why?
I think it's called the sunk cost fallacy.
Okay, so it is a morale issue. So yeah, there is a sunk cost thing. You know, the idea that you've already spent this much blood, money, effort, whatever. But really, practically, why can he not lose?
Because if they lost one, it would be on the hook for execution.
He's gonna hang. He's
They're
gonna
all his
hang.
friends.
All the members of Congress are gonna hang. He's gonna hang. Probably most of the officers in the Army are gonna hang. Okay? So what the enlisted guys can just kind of slink off and go back to their farms or wherever and, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I was never in the Army. But the officers and the generals and the congressmen, those guys, it's all or nothing for them. After the decision is made to have a revolution as opposed to just appealing for our rights thing, okay? It's all or nothing. If they lose everything. So that's what he's saying publicly because he doesn't have a choice. But privately, he thinks we're toast. Now, how does the revolution get saved at this point? Well, 2 battles within about a week of each other, Trenton and Princeton, where the Americans succeed. The Battle of Trenton is the most famous. You've probably heard of this one. This is where there's a Hessian unit. Look at that. Okay, so just to clarify, the myth, because a lot of what I'm going to do in this course is demythologized, right? So the myth is these evil, bloodthirsty mercenaries are sent to America, German mercenaries, to slaughter innocent Americans. The reality is these German states had for a long time been renting out parts of their army. They're not mercenaries in the sense that they're a bunch of cutthroats who've been recruited. They're part of the Hessian army that is being rented out. Now, why can the British do that? Well, remember, at that point, the King of England is also the King of Hanover. Okay? So he is both the German king and the English king simultaneously. They'll split that off in the 1820s or 30s. And one branch of the family will take the German side, and the other branch of the family will take the English side. But at that point, George III is both. So him getting Germans to fight for him is not that weird. It's like he's asking his next door neighbor, hey, can you help me out with this? Now he's paying them. It's not out of the goodness of their own hearts. But this is not, this is not what it's kind of projected to be. And these guys are incredibly civilized soldiers. In fact, arguably, they're more civilized soldiers than some of the British regiments, and especially the Loyalists. Some of the worst atrocities committed in the American Revolution were by the Loyalists against other Americans, because they considered them to be traitors and besmirching my good name as a member of the British Empire. So the Hessians had celebrated the night before because it was Christmas. And they'd celebrated a lot. They're Germans after all, okay? They like their beer. And so the next morning, Washington crosses the Delaware, and he attacks them when they're all hungover. In fact, he catches the Hessian commander, I think, is captured in bed. Okay? And it's a cheap victory, and a lot of people are kind of like, oh, that was unfair, that was ungentlemanly. And Washington says,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, well, I was desperate. I needed a win because my army was about to disintegrate. So, cheap victory? It's a victory. I don't care if it's cheap or not. Okay? Yeah. Okay? So, he got a cheap victory, but it's still a victory. Right? Now, it's also important to remember that when we talk about the British, we're not just talking about one thing. So there's the British regulars. We've got the Royal Navy, which at that time is the best navy in the world. For a period of about 200 years, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, is the best navy in the world, bar none. From like the early mid 1700s to the early 20th century. Certainly to World War I. They are the best navy in the world. They've got those mercenaries, but there's also, once again, the Indians picked the wrong side, just like they did in the French and Indian War, and they ally with the British. Why? Because remember, the British had said, remember that imaginary line through the mountains? No white people west of this line. So the Indians are going, hey, the British are on our side. Not really, but the British are on our side because they don't want white people going over here. Okay? They don't want settlers over here. So if I got a choice between the guys who want to take our land and the guys who are making this imaginary line and saying don't take their land, I'm going to pick those guys. Even though in the last war, they fought alongside the French because the British were the bad guys. Okay? And then, like I said, the Loyalists. You got these Loyalist regiments, at least 2, maybe 3, I can't remember off the top of my head, Loyalists. So the British, again, on paper, there's no way the British lose this. They're incredibly wealthy. They've got all these best navy in the world, a good, small but good army. They can pay for additional troops. And they've even got members, they've even got Americans who are willing to fight for them. Okay? It shouldn't have happened any other way except victory. But it does. So, what are the problems? What handicaps do the British face in this? Well, a divided populace. And by this, I don't just mean the populace in America. I mean the populace in Britain is divided on this. Okay? For the colonists, it's obvious. You're the enemy, plus you brought in these mercenaries. In Britain, though, this is a divisive thing because why are we spending all this money? Excuse me. Why are we spending all this money on these guys? What are we getting from America again? What about America makes it worth spending all this money? What's the magic we're getting out of America?
Goods, commerce goods.
I mean, I guess you could make that argument. You know, tobacco, cotton, stuff like that.
It's not about the money. It's about sending a message. You can't
It's about
just
pride
leave.
at a certain point. It's not about money. Because if we let them do this, then what about the Canadians? What about Jamaica? What about the Bahamas? What about the places they have in Africa? Okay? If you let one do this, they're all going to do it. So we got to smack them down. The other thing is the French. Okay? They're afraid of French intervention. And the longer this war goes, the more likely French intervention becomes. Because if they can quickly squash the rebellion, then France doesn't have a chance to get involved. And it also shows the Americans wasn't worth supporting them. But every month that this thing keeps going longer, and the British, are not winning, then the French are going, maybe there's something to this. And maybe we could get Quebec back. Ooh, now it's really getting interesting. Okay, so we could possibly get Quebec back, and we could poke our finger in the British eye. Ooh, this is sounding really good.
Bless you.
Thank you.
I like this. So they have these handicaps. And then on top of it, the British make some substantial errors. Firstly, they mishandle the Loyalists. By and large, the British treat the Americans with contempt.
What happened to those generous offers before?
That was only in New York and New Jersey.
Wow.
That was only in New York and New Jersey. That local commander, see, this is one of the other things I don't mean. Well, yeah, actually, the very next one goes to that next point, divided command. There isn't a supreme British commander for all of North America
Oh.
who can say, this is our policy, this is what we're going to do. It's very localized.
Oh.
So the guy who's up in New York, New Jersey, he's actually very generous, and there's almost no problems in New York and New Jersey for the rest of the war. Because the locals are like, well, we kind of weren't that into this revolution anyway. All right, cool, we're fine, okay? But because you don't have a single commander, it's all local. And sometimes we're talking about like a colonel deciding the fate of an entire colony because he's a jerk. He's going to punish these darned upstart Americans. Well, that's it. South Carolina's gone. I'm just picking a random colony, okay?
And those locals, they probably weren't into a revolution before, but now they are.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You take people who might have been leaning toward loyalty, you bring in some pompous jerk commander on the British side who starts penalizing people for no apparent reason, and then suddenly, okay, you know what? Maybe this whole having our own country thing is a good idea after all. You could change the opinion that quickly. And in these kind of wars, we could look at Vietnam, we could look at Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan was its own special bit of stupidity, but we could look at these, and you can see that. Go look at the articles in the newspaper where local commanders are sometimes making good decisions, and it's calming things down, and other local commanders are making bad decisions, and it's making things worse. Okay? So again, mishandling the loyalists, which goes hand in hand with this divided command. There's no unity. We don't just have one person running the whole thing, and that's what you get. Now, having said that, we could have had one commander who was stupid and screwed the whole thing up. So just having a unified command did not guarantee victory if you had an incompetent commander, right? So I don't want to make it sound like, if they just had one commander, they would have won. No, you still could have screwed that up. There are infinite ways you could screw this up, guys. There isn't just one way. There's infinite ways you could screw this up. The British happen to find their particular way to screw this up, but...
Royally.
What's that?
Royally.
Yes, royally. Ooh, very good.
I see what
Very
you did
good.
there.
Royally screwed it up. Very good. So, that's part of the issue. Now, let's talk about the militia. Let's go back and talk about the militia for a second. I don't want to give you this picture of the militia that they're just hopelessly incompetent and worthless in every single way. Because there are some positives to the militia. So let's look at some of the advantages. For instance, the militia can mobilize and organize very quickly because it is local. So let's say the British march into your county. Okay, they march into Harris County. I know Texas wasn't part of it, but just play along with me. They march into Harris County. Well, boom, that's easy. Everybody in Harris County can grab their musket. Boom, there's your force. Okay, so they can do that. That's positive.
They also used quick mobilization from fighting Indians.
Yes, and that's where they got that from, right? They had already done that because if there was an Indian attack, they had to learn how to mobilize quickly for that. So that's exactly where they got that from. They know the local terrain, so they can, if you show up, they're gonna know, oh, if we can just get the British over there, man, that's just basically a giant swamp.
We can just drown them.
Yeah, or at least bog them down so much we can just pick them off, okay? So if we can just lead them on a wild goose chase, let them right in the swamp, that's good, okay? They ensure the local loyalty of the people. So if your dad, brother, uncle, son is in the militia, how likely is it you're going to side with the British? Probably not. Now, hey, every family's got their disputes.
They're black sheep.
Okay, everyone's got their disputes and their black sheep. Okay, got that?
To the army.
Got that. See, I would have said it the other way. But generally, that's going to, ensure that you're going to be loyal to the cause because your relative is in the service. The idea of citizen responsibility, and this is a huge thing, and this is, I would argue, something we have absolutely lost, is the idea that you owe something to the nation other than taxes. And that was what the militia was good at, is you could say, well, at least I'm in the militia. If nothing else, you don't do anything else except pay taxes, but at least you're in the militia. Okay, you're doing something. Okay? You're doing something to help the nation itself. And lastly, this one's both good and bad, but I put it under the good because I wanted another good. They have no perceived ideas about duties, which could be good because we can use them for things that they weren't intended for, but it could be bad because, as we talked about with the French and Indian War, the American militia are far more likely to go, hey, I'm not here to build roads, dude. I'm here to fight the French. And if there are no French about, go get some engineers to build those roads. I'm not building roads. Okay? So that's both a good and a bad, but I didn't want to have a third category for just one thing. So no preconceived notion of duties, positive and negative at the same time. All right, so there's the positives. That's how you always, when you're going to give somebody a bad evaluation, you always start with the good things.
That's right.
Okay, you're always on time. And then you tell them, okay, but you're terrible at your job.
Yeah.
Okay. So, disadvantages. They resist discipline. Well, this is just like the French and Indian War. Nothing's changed. In fact, I will tell you guys, nothing's changed in 250 years. Okay? Americans still have that attitude. We resist discipline today. Okay? And in the military, that's why you have basic training where they break you down and they inculcate certain things to you, because otherwise, it's a mob. You'd be a mob. Okay? You have to do that. And even after those people have been trained, there are issues. There are discipline problems. Okay? Yeah. So you were in the Army, right? Marine Corps. Okay. So what rank did you get out as?
Corporal.
Corporal. Okay. So were you actually in charge of anybody at some point as a corporal?
Yeah, but not many people.
Not that many people. But did you have any issues with discipline issues?
For sure.
Yeah. And likewise in the Navy?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I got out as an E6. There's only 3 things: show up to work, show up to work on time, be in the right uniform, and do what you're told. And surprisingly enough, showing up and being in the right uniform was the hardest thing for everybody. Like, you have a proper working uniform. That's what we are supposed to be in. Why are you not dressed?
That's really scary. The showing up, okay, I get that. I'm a lazy SOB. But the not having, it's a uniform for a reason. You don't have a lot of choices.
Right.
What should I wear today?
Right.
Oh, the thing I've worn every day for the last 4 years.
So therefore, you know you need a t-shirt underneath it.
Yeah, so anyway, simple training, no standardization of arms. These guys barely know what they're doing. Like, they can fire their musket, but
Can't wear the right uniform.
yeah, they're definitely not wearing the right uniform.
Well, to be fair, if all the enemies wearing uniforms, it's easy to tell apart, you know?
Well, that's one thing. If it's somebody in a uniform, shoot at them. It ain't us. But yeah, again, these guys know how to fire their muskets, but like quickly firing their muskets? No. Okay. They're not prepared for that. That might be a little too much. They're used to lining up that shot on that buck, you know, or whatever it is, or that turkey or whatever. They're not used to load and fire, rapid fire, rapid fire, rapid fire.
That's how you stagger your shots. One line fires and the other.
Exactly, you get that kind of thing.
Muskets aren't really known for rapid shooting, so.
No, but
Stagger.
they're better than early rifles, as we'll talk about in a second, because the next thing we're going to talk about firearms. And there's no standardization. You might have a 54 caliber musket. You might have a 45 caliber musket. You might have basically a shotgun. Okay.
45, because they don't make it 46.
Right. So, again, you have to make your own. You have to have your own mold and cast your own lead bullets, because there's no way in the militia. Again, we're talking about the militia, not the Continental Army. But in the militia, we have no standardization. So you have to have your own mold to cast your own bullets, because otherwise, I can't. What caliber do you have? I might have 30 different calibers. I mean, probably not that crazy. There's probably a certain level of standardization. It's probably 3 or 4. But even 3 or 4, logistically, I can't support that. I'll give you gunpowder, but the bullets are on your own. The militia are not going to stand and fight against a conventional army. So if there's a conventional army and they're blasting away, the militia is going to take a shot or two, and then they're going to decide they need to be somewhere else. That whole idea of standing in a line and we're just going to exchange blows until one side breaks, militia are not going to do that. And that is just human instinct. Human instinct says, get the heck out of here, people are shooting at you. Okay? And that's one of the things military training does, is it prevents you from having your natural instinct to run the heck away. It prevents you from doing that, or at least tries to prevent you from doing that. Because yeah, any rational person does not want to be shot at. They like maybe shooting at other people, but they certainly don't like them shooting back. And so the militia are terrible about that. And then lastly, their term of service is short. By this point, we're not talking, in some cases, we're not talking about literally show up, fight the battle, go home. We are talking about enlistment periods. But the enlistment periods are generally never more than about 3-4 months. Because you're militia, you're not a regular. And the attitude is more than that, nah, that's regular. I'll go do it for 3 months because I've got nothing else to do for the next 3 months. I don't have to plant, I don't have to harvest, I don't have to do whatever. But past that, I'm not interested in being on active duty. Heck, I knew guys like that in the Guard and Reserve. Though that attitude changed, post 9/11. So that's another issue. Now, let's talk about firearms, all right? Let's talk about firearms and weapons effectiveness. Now, the standard weapon of the time, whether it's French or British, Prussian, doesn't matter, is generally called a fusel, which is just another name for a musket. This is a smooth bore weapon. There's no rifling. Rifling are those lands and grooves inside the barrel that make the bullet spin and make it more accurate, okay? This is smooth bore, it's just straight, okay? Just like a pipe. You can see it comes with a bayonet, okay? And your rate of fire on these is generally between 2 and 5 rounds a minute. That's all based on how well trained you are to operate under fire, okay? Right. Now, back in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s, some historians decided to test how accurate these Prussian-style muskets were. So they set up literally bed sheets in a field that were 6 feet tall by 100 feet. So they literally, on stakes, they staked out white bed sheets across this field, 6 feet tall, 100 feet wide. And then they shot at it from 80, 160, 240, and 320 yards. That's how many hits they got at those distances.
Wow, that's not.
It's pathetic. Because remember, no one's shooting at these historians.
Yeah.
And they're taking their time, loading, lining up the shot.
Out of bed sheet, too.
Yes.
Ideal conditions.
Ideal conditions. And even at 80 yards, less than 50%, because they shot 100 at each level. Less than 50% at 80 yards. And remember, the bed sheet is going to register no matter where you hit it. Whereas if it's a group of men, there are gaps. You know what I'm saying? You could shoot through a rank of men, and if everybody's straight, you could just go right down the middle, not hit a single person. So when we say 46%, that wouldn't necessarily equate to 46% casualties on a battlefield. It would actually probably be a little bit lower. So what does this say about a musket?
Terrible.
It's not a great weapon.
Probably
Now again, remember at the time, we don't have a lot of other options. But we do have this, a Jaeger, or rifle. Jaeger just means hunter in German, okay? So a rifle, where it does have those lands and grooves. The problem with the Jaeger is, you can only fire about 1 round a minute. Now, why is that? Well, the smoothbore musket, you can have the bullet be narrower than the diameter of the barrel. Just drop it in, make sure it's seated properly, and you're good. To engage the rifling in the barrel, the bullet had to be the same size as the barrel. So literally what you're doing is you're having to force this soft lead bullet, force it down into the grooves to catch the grooves, because if it's narrower, it'll just fire straight out and it won't engage the rifling. So what good is a rifle that doesn't engage the rifling? It doesn't make any sense. So the way you would do it is you'd put a patch, and then the ball, you'd put the powder in first, then a patch, then the ball, and then you'd have a little starter. You wouldn't use your ramrod. You'd have a little wooden starter rod like this long, and then you're gonna force, well, first you'd force it a little bit with your finger, and then you'd force this thing down, and then you get your ramrod and you force it all the way down the rest of the way, okay? So that's why you can only fire about 1 round a minute. Oh, and here's another problem. Generally, they didn't have bayonets because they weren't intended to be a frontline weapon. And you had to clean the bore every 5 to 8 rounds. Why? It's black powder. When you fire that gunpowder, it cakes up in the lands and grooves. And so after about 5 to 8 rounds, you've got a smoothbore, whether you know it or not, because it is so full of that dirty powder. Man.
So, talk to me like I'm a little slow, but right now the way I see it, it's like when they pour it in, the one thing that's like, isn't that the gunpowder, or what's the little balls that they used to, because I'm talking about movies, of course, like when they show them pouring it in, like is that the gunpowder that they're pouring in?
Yes, the loose stuff is the powder.
Okay, and that's what they
And then you put a patch, just usually a piece of linen, to hold so that the powder doesn't spill out.
Okay.
You gotta be careful.
And then the lead, and then once you ram that down, the patch sitting up on behind the lead is holding the powder down. And when it discharges, there's so much charcoal in that mix, in the old black powder mix, that it's like burning something inside your barrel.
But these are all long barreled, correct? So
Right.
therefore, like, at some time and point, if it's not all straight, okay, up and
Yeah.
down, then, okay.
Yeah, and that's why you have to stand in your ranks.
Okay.
You have to, because you need gravity to drop that powder to the bottom.
Gotcha.
How did they?
You try and load it this way, I mean, you could theoretically scoot it down, but I'm sure you're gonna lose some of the powder, and if you don't have the right powder charge, then the bullet's gonna come out, but it's gonna come out rather slow, and it might just literally go 20, 30 feet and just drop into the dirt. Please.
So you're saying that a dude with like a pitchfork can just absolutely destroy soldiers while they're cleaning out their...
Yeah. Okay. Now, generally, these guys would carry a knife or something else. You know, they're going to have another weapon. But the problem with these is they're just too slow. They're great when you're shooting them. Don't get me wrong, because you can shoot way better, way further. And in fact, this is the difference. In a smoothbore weapon with a round ball, you can kill out to about 50 yards, maybe wound out to about 100. With a rifle and a round ball, you can kill at 100, wound maybe out as far as 300. So that's double the kill distance and 3 times the wound distance. But what are you giving up for it? A lot. And that will change when somebody invents the mini ball. Then the mini ball will fundamentally change this, but that's way later. That's 1840s, please.
How often do you have to clean the muskets? A lot less.
You can keep going the whole battle, just blasting away, because there's nothing for the powder to cake on. It's just a smooth barrel. So there's nothing inside that it's going to cake. I mean, it's going to get dirty, but it's not going to affect the ability to fire. Please, and we'll go here in a second, but let me get to this gentleman. Yes.
Would like the rain affect like the fire?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, if it's like a Houston rain, forget it. You're not fighting.
Well, even
I mean, you sit up a bayonet.
Yeah, if you want to do that.
You have to pull out your swords and daggers.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, you can't forget it. And sometimes even a light rain, like a drizzle, might be enough if the powder is getting wet enough. Yeah, even that might be enough that it'll prevent you from firing. And I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was asked, how did they measure the right amount of powder? Because like too little does nothing, too much blows up a gun.
Right.
They
So
already had it all sectioned out in bags, and that was.
right. It depends on how professional your army is. So if you've got a really good army like the British, they have pre-measured cartridges, which is just linen, not paper, because paper's still very expensive at this time. They haven't perfected making cheap paper. So linen is a type of cloth, and what you do is it's just this little like rectangular piece of linen, and they pour in the right amount of powder, and then they put a ball in. This is again for the standardized army, not the militia, not any of that. And then they just wrap it up all tight, and you have a cartridge pouch where you reach in and you have the amount of powder you need and the ball right there. And so you can boom, 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 you can do it really quick. If you're the militia, you're literally doing the powder horn thing. Like you've seen in movies, some of that's real, some of them are literally doing the powder horn thing. And that's, yeah, you're getting into, the guy should, if he's experienced enough, he's gonna know, okay, 1, 2, 3, or whatever, he's gonna have some little system, like how much powder pours out. But if he's not really good, yes, he's gonna put too little, he's gonna put too much. Too much blows up your barrel, too little means just plops out the barrel. Please. Okay. So, again, these weapons are not great, but this is the best we got, okay? We just came from having arquebuses, okay? Which is a thing where you didn't have the flint to create the spark. You had literally what's called a slow match, which is a piece of cloth that you have to constantly keep lit. You keep blowing on it so it stays red. And then you'd have this contraption where there's an arm holding this lit thing and it would touch the powder. That led to like so many times people getting accidentally blown up.
I can see
Because
that.
you got black powder and something lit together. That was an absolute disaster. Please.
What about the pistols?
Pistols are around, but remember, we're talking one-shot pistols. So the only people who really carry pistols, generally speaking, are cavalry, because they'll have what are called horse pistols, which are these pistols that they're about the size of a carbine nowadays, like an AR carbine. That's how big they were, they were so big because they were designed to be carried in holsters on your horse. You'd usually carry either 2 or 4. Officers would sometimes have pistols, but even then, it was kind of like, what was the point? You had to shoot it once, and then you turned it around, and that's why those old-fashioned pistols would have a big metal thing on the end of the handle. There'd be that big metal knob there, and the reason that was is because you'd then turn it around and you'd bash people's skulls in with it. So, yeah, there are pistols, but
this was way before technically automatic, though, right?
oh yeah.
Automatic weapons?
Oh yeah. Oh, way before any of that kind of stuff. The revolver hasn't been invented. Sam Colt won't invent that until 1837. So yeah, we're way ahead of this. So these weapons are pathetic by our standards, but for the time, they're actually better than what they just had 30, 40 years ago, which is those arquebuses. So I just wanted to give you a context of what we're doing. Now, okay, I want to show you this quote. This is a quote from a Prussian officer who's at the Battle of Zornsdorf in 1757. So this is just a little before the American Revolution. This is how bad these battlefields could be, and why if you're a professional army, you have to create a culture of forbearance. Let me show you the quote. This guy survived without a scratch.
Sounds like a pretty hairy battle.
Yeah. So this is just 20 years before the revolution. That's what it's like to be on this battlefield. So that's why I have to have a professional army that will stand and keep trading shots with the enemy, because the army that doesn't break is the army that wins. So absolute discipline, unwillingness to retreat. That's the only way you're going to win on this battlefield. It's horrific. I mean, it's absolutely horrific, because you have to stand there and make yourself a target. It's insane. But there's no other way to do it, because again, I can't load the musket except standing up. I mean, yeah, in a perfect world I can get behind a tree, but
Maybe on top of a hill.
yeah, or something like that. But I mean, in most cases, that's not how battles are going to be. And it's gruesome. And like I say, this guy would, by our standards, this guy should have pretty severe PTSD. Just after that one battle. I know I would. Okay?
It's just a Tuesday for him, though.
What's that?
It's just Tuesday.
Yeah, that was just Tuesday for him. Yeah, exactly. So, what is his situation here? Well, he has to use the militia, okay? But they prevent him from doing long-term planning and organization. But he has to use them. Why? Because he's authorized 80,000 troops for Congress, but he has 8. So anytime he's fighting a battle, he has to call upon the local militia to beef up his army. So he has a decent-sized army to do the fighting. And the hope, of course, is that the British will see this huge American force and they won't want to fight. That's the hope. It generally doesn't work, but
Couldn't you know that made up of like cardboard cutouts put in the field?
yeah, not quite. But that was not a bad idea. Please.
And didn't Washington request no pay except for living expenses?
Yes.
How do you do that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a whole other thing. Washington, when he's appointed commander-in-chief of the army, says, "I will not accept pay. Just pay my expenses." And his expenses were like 10 times his pay over the course of the whole revolution. So, yeah. His officers are all political appointees. Washington's officers. They're all political appointees. And again, that will continue until the Spanish-American War in 1898, when it comes to the militia and later the National Guard. Okay? So, competence is not a requirement to be an officer in the Continental Army.
Still isn't. Sorry. Couldn't resist, sorry.
Hey, I resemble that remark. So, what pays is having an uncle or a cousin or a brother or a father or somebody like that who's politically connected. That's what's going to get you commission. The pay in the Continental Army for the whole war is inadequate. There are times where for months the Army doesn't get paid. And that's because Congress, the Continental Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, doesn't have the ability to raise taxes. The Continental Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, has to ask the states to give them money. They can't force the states to give them money. They have to ask the states to give them money in order to pay their bills. Now, granted, given the world we live in right now, that seems attractive to many of us, but you just can't run a government that way. It's impractical, okay? You just can't do that. And there's no retirement pay. In fact, there's no disability pay. There will be after the war. So after the war, after we've got the Constitution and all that, there'll be veterans who will have lost a leg or an arm or be disabled in some way who will apply to get some sort of pension or something like that. And most of them will be granted it. But that's like 20 years later. So you lose an arm or a leg at the time, the best you're going to get is they'll take up a collection in your unit. Okay, well, Jim, lost an arm in that last battle. He's going back home. Let's pass around the hat. Come on, guys. Come on. That's so. Whenever anybody look, my dad worked for the VA for 27 years. Had nothing good to say about it. But compared to what we have now, yeah, that's a lot worse. As screwed up as the VA is, that's a lot worse. And again, it won't be till the late 1780s, maybe early 1790s, before they'll actually try and do something like that. And there's still no regular retirement or anything like that in the U.S. Army until, I think it's after the Civil War. I don't think there's a regular pension system in the U.S. Army until after the Civil War. So, yeah. And then lastly, these untrained troops hinder maneuver. Because, you know, if you got to march from point A to point B, and you're a professional force, you have a certain march tables, you know how quickly your army can move, et cetera, et cetera. When you're dealing with the militia, they're just going to kind of sling the rifle over their shoulder and just kind of amble along. All right, you know. What if we run into the British force when we're not expecting it? You guys, the way you're draggled all over the place, you get wiped out. That's just how we do it. Okay, great, thanks. So, Washington makes his opinion of what he needs absolutely clear in 1777. We need a regular army. We need a well-trained, well-disciplined, well-supplied, well-organized, regular army.
Kind of a bad conclusion to come to in the middle of a war.
Yes. Well, I think he probably already knew that going into the war, but he certainly learned it by 1777. Okay? Now, again, this goes against the myth. The myth is that it's the citizen soldier who won the American Revolution. Lexington and Concord. Yeah, that's not. That Lexington and Concord, okay, yeah, give you that one, but yeah, after that, no. But that becomes the standard in American history. Every time we have a war, when the war's over, we get rid of almost all the army. And then we start the next war wholly unprepared for what we're going to happen.
Even though it just happened.
Even though it just happened, we get our butts whooped at the beginning of the war. Then we figure out, oh yeah, this is how we should do it. And at the end of the war, get rid of it again. And that happened up to World War II, and it's only since World War II that we've kept a decent-sized military.
Mostly because of the Cold War.
Yes, and that's mostly because of the Cold War.
Oh, kept a decent size.
Decent size.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, decent size. I wouldn't say big. I wouldn't say as big as we needed necessarily, but a decent size. When you compare like percentage of people in the military to the population, and you look, you know, the rest of American history and then Cold War, and to today. Arguably, right now we're a little lower because our population's so much bigger. We're lower than the Cold War, but we're still higher than like peacetime prior to World War II. I'd have to run the numbers, but I know where ballpark where it is. Now, how does he get that army? He gets that army starting in Valley Forge in 1778 because of this man. Anybody know who that is? No. You're close. Von Steuben. Von Steuben. Lieutenant General Baron Friedrich von Steuben, who was not a lieutenant general, and he was not a baron, and he was not a von. He lied about all of that. Okay? He had been a major in the Prussian army, which is still pretty impressive. He was a commoner. He was not a baron. And the von, it means you're a nobleman. So even if you don't have a title, if your name is von something, that meant you were a nobleman. And the von was fake. He added that later on too. So these lies about almost everything except the most important thing, and that is he knows how to train troops. And it is at Valley Forge that the army becomes an army. They learn how to drill, they learn how to march, all that stuff that they do in basic training now that you never use again except for some change of command ceremony or some crap like that. That was how you actually fought in those days. And he's the one who is able to train the army how to do that, in large part. He also writes the first army manual, which is still in use until almost before, I think it's 1808, they finally get a new manual. So we almost are fighting the War of 1812 before they get rid of the manual that this guy wrote, which is basically just copying all the stuff he did in Prussia. So, as a result of that, we have a resurgence. We have a new beginning. We get a victory at Saratoga, which is huge. This is a huge, huge victory for us. It's not a cheap victory like we've gotten before. And just a few months later, in part because of that Saratoga victory, the French agree to support us. Okay? The French agree to support us. That is the turning point. Once the French agree to support us, we actually have a chance. And as I said before, this is a horrible decision for the French. This will totally backfire on them. But it's one of those events, guys, that really seemed like a good idea at the time. And history is riddled with decisions that at the time made complete sense. But in retrospect, you go, what was this idiot thinking? Okay? But they're not idiots. They're not stupid.
They just don't have the power to look in the future.
Exactly. I'm going to get revenge on the British. I might get Quebec back. What's the downside to this? They have no way of knowing what the repercussions are going to be, the second and third order repercussions. And so don't fall into that trap. Okay, for those of you who are history majors, you're going to be history teachers, maybe professors. Don't fall into that trap of thinking that people in the past were stupid and we're smart. I've got a t-shirt that says study history and realize we've been this stupid for thousands of years. Okay, because it's true. Yes, absolutely. Everybody, and by the way, 100 years ago, they thought everybody in the past was stupid and they were smart, and now we look back at them and say they're stupid and we're smart. And 100 years from now, it's going to be the exact same thing. People are going to say, oh, those people in the early 2000s, my God, how stupid were they?
You know, another positive of French joined us, it was probably my favorite song from Hamilton.
Okay. I wasn't thinking in those terms, but okay, please.
Was there no major impact on
The Benedict Arnold situation was not, it didn't have a significant impact long term, thankfully. It could have. Everybody I think knows Benedict Arnold was actually one of our most successful commanders early in the war. And it was a combination of him feeling that he didn't get the glory he had earned. He also financed some stuff out of his own pocket, and Congress refused to pay him back. And his wife was a loyalist. His wife came from a loyalist family in Philadelphia, and so she was also constantly whispering in her ear, you know, we really shouldn't be doing this, we should be loyal to the king. And so he sells the plans to West Point, which in those days was not an academy, it was just a fort. And he's then through a series of circumstances, the guy he gives the plans to gets captured, he has to flee, all that. It's a sad situation because again, he was a really good general. In fact, I would argue he might have been our single best general, American-born general, in the early part of the war, because obviously he's not with us later on. And it's sad and it's unfortunate, but yeah. And then of course his name becomes a byproduct for treachery for the rest of history. Please.
So if this all happened around 1777, then how was the Navy born in 1775? Was that?
But the Army and the Navy were formed right when the Revolution began.
Okay.
Yeah, both the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps were all formed in 1775. And it's this point where we really start to be more successful in this because of the French. The Navy, and the Navy more than any other, well, Marine Corps, but that's a whole weird other thing. But the Navy historically was always tight. It's not until Theodore Roosevelt that we have a decent sized Navy from then onward. But the Navy was, because the Navy is much more expensive than the Army. Because if you think about it, how hard is it to just recruit 10,000 people? That's not that hard. How hard is it to build ships? Oh wait, you have to actually know what you're doing. Okay? The Army has proved time and time again, you can create an army without knowing anything about creating an army. We've done that a whole bunch of times. The Navy, on the other hand, you have to know how to build a ship, you have to know how to provision a ship, you have to know how to sail a ship. Yeah. There's all these skill sets you need to know. Whereas to be in the Army, can you fire a gun? Yep, you're in. That's it. Okay? Ultimately, historians argue that our success, our version of military operations, is a combination of the European theory along with our own military heritage and capabilities. Like the thing about Americans is, Americans will just make stuff up. Okay? Americans will not do something out of a manual if it's stupid and it's getting people hurt or killed. They will throw that away, and at the lower levels, I'm talking captains and below, those people will just say, screw this, we're going to do this other thing because that doesn't make any sense. Now, majors and above, or lieutenant commanders and above, different animals, okay? Different animals, okay? And sergeant majors too, I don't trust those SOBs. Sergeant majors and majors and above, those guys are different animals. But company grade and below, they're going to just say, this is stupid, let's try something else. Okay? And, you know, in World War II, one of the things the Germans would always be frustrated about is the senior German officers had all read our doctrine, knew how we fought, and then they'd fight us, and we wouldn't fight that way. And it was maddening to them. It's like, what? They don't follow their own doctrine. Yeah, because we figured out that didn't work, so we just stopped doing it. Okay? And so that's the only reason I would argue we've been as successful as we have as a nation. These guys just making stuff up when the original stuff didn't work.
Make it till you make it.
Okay, there you go. So the French signed an alliance with us. This is Rochambeau in his letter back to France, telling them how's it going. This is 1780. So this is what he has to say. It's not inaccurate.
Very, very good.
I'd love to say, oh, he's a Frenchman, he doesn't know it. No, it's there. Yeah, it's pretty much true. Yeah. It's true. And so it is French money, French soldiers, but also some other European volunteers who are going to make this work. So we have Casimir Pulaski, the founder of the American Cavalry, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the founder of the Army Corps of Engineers, Lafayette, who is basically, he serves most of the war as George Washington's aide. Okay, he only gets to command at the very end of the war. He and Washington develop a very close relationship. His father had died when he was young, and Washington never had any children of his own. And so most people argue that they had basically a father and son relationship.
Wasn't he like 18 when he came?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was already a veteran of 5 years of active military service at age 18. Yeah, he joined the Army at age 13. He was a lieutenant at age 13.
Wow.
So, yeah. And then lastly, Baron de Kalb, who another German who faked most of his resume because he wasn't a baron, he wasn't a von, et cetera, et cetera. He actually dies in the service of our country. Pulaski and de Kalb died serving America. So these are some of the best. There's a whole bunch of other guys who are more adventurers, who really are there for the money or stuff like that. These are some of the better examples of guys who are really there because they believe in the cause. So Some of the foreign volunteers are kind of cruddy, but these are the ones who are the better ones. So, ultimately, the militia will find a role. They will find something they're good at. What are they good at? They're good at local or regional control and security. They can keep the county of Suffolk in Virginia safe from the British, or at least let Washington know when the British are invading Suffolk County. Okay, so they're good at that. They're good at threatening enemy lines of communication. LOC is lines of communication. Lines of communication is not just communication, it's supply. So your locks. Okay, they're really good at that because that doesn't involve a stand-up fight. That involves figuring out where the wagon trains are coming through and ambushing their wagon trains. So in essence, you get to be a criminal without being a criminal. The Americans turn out to be really good at that. Okay? They turn out to be really good at being bandits. Except no, we're doing this is official, this is official duty. Okay? They're able to threaten enemy isolated bases. So in instances where the British have a base, like the fire base concept in Vietnam or the FOBs or those kind, when they have those kind of things, we're able to isolate those bases and sometimes lay siege to them.
So this is where Fort Story and Little Creek comes into play. So those were the forts that they tried to, okay.
For local control on their point of view, but from our point of view, that just makes you sitting ducks. It isolates you, and now we can do what we want. We can cut you off, we can lay siege, etc. And yes, they provide short-term mass. We can get a whole bunch of people for a very brief period of time. Not for long-term, but maybe we can go ahead and trick the British, like Washington's helping. And there are 1 or 2 battles where the British will actually pull back and won't engage when they see a large force, even though it turns out the majority of that force were militia who wouldn't have lasted more than 2 shots. But there are a few times where it actually works. Not many. Not many. It's like a handful, but it does work a few times. Lastly, logistics support. Logistics, meaning food, equipment, things like that. They provide logistical support in that if there's a local militia who are supporting you, when you go into that town, they're not going to jack up the prices on stuff. They're going to pull the stuff out of the cellar they're hiding from the British and be willing to sell or trade. Okay, so they can do that. So ultimately, the militia finds a role, but let's be honest, it's not what they thought they could do, and it's not what the myth that sold after the war is. They're successful as long as you only do these things. Try to do anything else, it's probably going to fail. But we've got a few things, they do those well, that's good. We'll take that.
I just wondered, did they get the Minutemen name during the war, or was it later on?
That's a good question, when that term actually comes about. I honestly don't know. I don't know if that's something that came about during that time or maybe even from the earlier period, against Indians or against the French. What's that?
Exactly, but I feel like it's like
Pre-revolution. I could believe that because it kind of makes sense. The whole idea that you can quickly assemble and everything. But yeah, I don't know, honestly. I could speculate, but it would probably end badly. So, okay. So, kind of wrap up the war. Let's wrap up the war. The campaign that ends the war is the Virginia Campaign of 1781. This is a campaign where finally Lafayette gets his own command. Washington puts him in charge of his own army. And over a course of several months, this is basically the summer of 1781, Cornwallis, the British commander, and Lafayette are maneuvering against each other, while at the same time, Washington and Rochambeau, the actual bigger, better part of the army, are marching down from the New York area to Williamsburg, Virginia, fighting a battle, and then ultimately laying siege to this army that Lafayette had backed into a corner. And that's at Yorktown. So this is an example of where we're actually fighting like a real army. More than half of the forces here, though, are French. More than half of the American forces are actually French. again, we're not going to get into the excruciating details of the battle because that's not the point. But while Cornwallis is distracted with Lafayette, Washington and Rochambeau march another army down, and then they catch Cornwallis. He gets into a corner at Yorktown, and they lay siege to him. Forgot to pass this around while we're doing this last minute thing. Just check yourself off. And so what happens is, so here's the route of march route, okay? So we've got Rochambeau and Washington marching down. We've got the French bottled up in Yorktown. And then an event happens that will happen only once in the next century. And that is the Royal Navy and the French Navy will meet. And the French Navy will win. Okay?
Some of the greatest navy in the world.
They defeat the British.
Not at that time.
For us, awesome. This is the only time for like 100 years when these two navies meet that the French win. And they win to help us. And yes. And we'll go back to this slide next time. I know we haven't thoroughly talked this through. So we'll finish this off.